Okay, so welcome back to Race, Place, and Inequality. Um, Today or this week, you should be reading about race, place, and Black placemaking. The erase work is Ta-Nehisi Coates, his intro to the case for reparations. If you get a chance, you can read the entire case for reparations. It's a phenomenal piece that was written in the Atlantic some years back. He might have won an award for it. I can't remember, but incredible piece of work. But that's just the intro. The case for reparations is very long. But just the intro part, I think he does a really good job of setting up his framework about race. And sometimes race scholarship, a lot of it's kind of old, especially people that set up their framework. So, I don't know. Sometimes I don't mind going to the really old stuff like Souls of Black Folk, which is like one of those pieces that help kind of lay the foundation for how we do race work, and other pieces that kind of, help lay that foundation as well. The Moynihan Report, and we will talk about the Moynihan Report, things that are both good as well as controversial. So I don't mind doing that, but sometimes I like to start with something a little more new. And so Ta-Nehisi Coates' case for reparations, it came out in the past few years. So I think that's something more modern that, you might be more interested in instead of reading, kind of the old stuff. But we will speak about that as well. So let's see. Yeah, so you have Ta-Nehisi Coates' piece. Then you have Place a Short Introduction. You were supposed to read that, and then I'm going to kind of expound on a lot of the thoughts and concepts that was put forth there, just to kind of introduce you to the notion of place. Place isn't something that's often talked about in sociology as well as some of the other disciplines. Place is typically a concept that stays within geography, right? So geographers as well as urbanists tend to kind of study place, right? However, place is something that's very much interdisciplinary. So there's a place for place in sociology and anthropology and African American studies, and political science and urban geography and demography, and so many different sciences. And so I do think it's important that we have a broad understanding of place. And then in specifically Black placemaking. Black placemaking is very new. Now, place in sociology has been around at least since the early part of the 21st century, so the 2000s. Definitely place has been something that's been talked about at least since the 1950s and 60s, but particularly in sociology, you kind of see elements of it a little bit in like the 80s and 90s, but definitely in the 2000s, a place, I think it's called a place for place in sociology, or a place in sociology, or something like that. The big article that just kind of really did a really good job at making a case for that. And since then, you start to see place and placemaking be more significant in that discipline. And so, so we talk about that, and then we go into Black placemaking. And Black placemaking is very new, and so I think that will be a good place to kind of help us transition into a lot of the readings that we're going to talk about, and specifically our textbook, which is Spatializing Blackness. So Spatializing Blackness kind of deals with space and place, but I think it's fine. You can talk about Spatializing Blackness in a space class or a place class. It doesn't matter. It's definitely purposeful either way. So yeah, so that's what we're gonna do. And this is for August 30th and for September 1st. This is when you should do these readings, and when you can, you should watch this lecture as well as do the PowerPoints. So with that being said, we can go straight into the first slide. So the first slide talks about Race and Racism from the perspective of Ta-Nehisi Coates. Ta-Nehisi Coates is a very famous writer, probably one of the most prolific writers of the 21st century. Some people might liken him to being the next James Baldwin, right? He's in the kind of conversation of how James Baldwin was writing about race in the 1950s and 1960s and 70s. Ta-Nehisi Coates is doing that now. Powerful brother from, I think he's from Baltimore. He went to Howard University in Washington, D.C. And if you know anything about him, he's very, very much a proud Howard Bison. He is not, he dropped out of college. I don't think he graduated. And he went straight into what it is that he wanted to do. He wanted to become a writer. And so he went on to do writing and journalism work and that sort of thing. And just kind of picked up from there. But incredible guy. Now he's a professor at Howard. Now he just got a position as a professor of Howard. But he also got a, what is that big award? It's some kind of, I think it starts with an M. I don't know it if I hear it, but I can't remember what it was. But he had like this big award where pretty much he was paid like all this crazy amount of money just to write articles and write books. We were 8 years in power about President Obama, Between the World and Me, where, you know, that book is going down in history now. Case for Reparations, all these other pieces he was just kind of paid to write. I forgot what the name of it was. It was like a grant, but he lived in Paris for a couple of years as he was writing, and now he's back in the States, and now he's teaching at Howard University. A MacArthur, I think that's what it's called, the MacArthur Fellowship. I think that's what it was. So yeah, anyway, so Ta-Nehisi Coates, big writer. And I thought that this was very, very important for us to really delve into his work and how he, at least for his argument, and I think this can definitely apply to this class as well, to set up the stage for how we discuss and talk about race. So the first thing he says is that racism is unnatural, racism as we know, right? So the type of racism that we know, the type of racism that exists within the US context is unnatural, right? There's nothing natural, there's nothing okay, there's nothing biological, essentially, about viewing people with darker skin as inferior, right? And this is something that a lot of people start off their racial analysis with. Even if you go back to David Walker's appeal to the colored citizens in what, 1820 something when he wrote that, or 30 something, maybe early 1830s when he wrote that. What to the Slave is the 4th of July. I think that came out in like the 1840s or 50s. By Frederick Douglass, or Du Bois's Souls of White Folk, right? Where the racial analysis starts with, first of all, there's nothing okay, there's nothing natural, there's nothing biological about looking down or feeling that one racial group or a person's skin color makes them inferior to another person. No person is inferior to anybody. You can have differences of beliefs, differences of opinion, but no one person is better than another person solely based on their race. So he makes that argument. And then also he falls within the tradition of race as a social construct. Race is not something that is biological. Race is something that gets created. It is an idea. It is an idea created by human beings. Therefore, it is an idea that can be destroyed by human beings if they so desire, right? And so race and racism are social constructs. They move, they're shaped, they're malleable. They mean whatever we want it to mean. Race is simply a reflection of the society in which it exists, right? So this is how Ta-Nehisi Coates starts this conversation around race and racism. He talks about other authors, and this is also what I like about this piece is, you know, he writes it just like you would write any type of scholarly essay, is he starts with the research, right? And what he's read and who he knows that has discussed this topic. And of course, St. Clair, Drake, You know, one of the most prolific, you know, sociologists of the 20th century, did a lot of work, a lot of surveys in Chicago, like he said, mostly known for Black Metropolis. So I don't think I had ever read, I have not read, as a matter of fact, Black, I think it's called, I think he said Black Here and There or something. And yeah, that, so I definitely need to read that, but he uses that as well as many other works, Nell Painter's work on whiteness and many other works to kind of help set the stage for his framework around what race is. And so St. Clair Drake, you know, looks at and assesses the perceptions, right? The ideas of people with darker skin, what people have about other people with darker skin, curlier hair across history. And what he finds is that there's very little consistency, right? Very little consistency. And so it kind of goes back to if you're in either of my other classes, or if you ever read these books, and feel free to write these down if you want to expand your library. But there's a book by George Fredrickson called A Short History of Race. And one of the key points of the early chapter is that race is not something that existed in the ancient world, right? We might think it did. You see elements, even if you're a Bible scholar, you know, or you study the Bible, you study history, obviously you see elements of discrimination and, you know, hatred and that sort of thing. And maybe something along the lines of skin tone, but it's not an entire system. It's not something that's popular. And so it's very little consistency throughout history that we see this idea of race and racism, not until you get to the modern world, not until you get to like the 1700s, maybe 16, 17, 1800s, definitely 17 and 1800s is where you really start to see, oh, this thing, race is a whole system. It's a point to this, and it's created, and it leads to, it has results. It has real results, even though it in and of itself is not real biologically, right? Another thing he says is that racism is a part, let me see. Oh yeah, racism is a product of the slave trade, which is to say the seizure of power. And so when we think about race and racism, even if you read George Fredrickson's work, he talks about how basically religious dissension actually helps set the stage for race and racism. It wasn't the black-white issue, it was really Christians and Jews, and their tension kind of set the stage for it, but it was not racism. It wasn't something that scholars or historians would call racism. Now we would look at like anti-Semitism as racism, but at that time it functioned a little differently. So, but in terms of the slave trade, and not just the transatlantic slave trade, even the Arab slave trade, though less popular, still had elements of a racial bias within it. But the transatlantic slave trade, absolutely. So the slave trade where Europeans went to West Africa and South Africa and took those people to the Americas, to South America, to the islands, Caribbean, and then eventually to the American South. Absolutely a system that started out based on capitalism, but soon would be based on race and have these large racial implications. And so race is essentially the product of this system. It is a product of the transatlantic slave trade. And transatlantic slave trade was put in place for power. There was racism did not precede capitalism. Racism is a product of capitalism. Racism is a product of power. Racism is a product of greed, right? So early Europeans were not racist against Africans, which is why they chose them. It was just that they looked at them as product, and that seemed to be the best product for what it is that they wanted to do, right? So it is a product of the slave trade. Again, which is to say that it is all about power. So power leads to the slave trade, which leads to the creation of race. And so what Ta-Nehisi Coates does, he says that Americans talk about race, but not racism, which is very, very interesting. right? Americans love to talk about or will talk about race, but don't necessarily like to talk about the things that race produces, the negative interactions and negative feelings that race produces. And in doing that, they turn a series of actions into a state. So they politicize everything. Everything becomes a political talking point. And so he says this is basically true of all of our conversations, whether you're talking about people on the left or people on the right or people in the middle, whether you're conservative, liberal, or in the middle, Democrat, Republican, in the middle. And you can see this in the terminology. He said you can see this in racial justice or racial quotas or racial discrimination. All of these are stately words. Justice, quotas, discrimination, stately words, words that have to do with something leading to the creation of legislation. But this language, what he says, this is ahistorical. And what it does is it allows for us to obscure or to not have to look at or not have to address the conflicts that exist in our society. And he uses affirmative action as an example. He says affirmative action is not intended to remedy some type of like plunder or action. It's not to, solve something that happened on the people without them knowing or something like that, right? But it's put in place to help women and people of color to have access to things that were denied them for decades and decades and even centuries. And it's there to produce diversity, right? So these are the effects of affirmative action. And diversity is, again, another stately word. And so the benefits of affirmative action are not people who have been plundered. It's not people who have been, been oppressed or disregarded. Because a lot of people have been oppressed and disregarded and whatever. Affirmative action isn't just about that. It's about Black people, the Black race. That's what it's based on. That's how it came about, because race and racism, historically in this country, at its foundation, is part of what we call in the discipline the Black-white binary. Now we can talk about, obviously, as we move closer to the 19th, out of the 19th and into the 20th century, you have more and more people coming into the United States, and their population is growing at a rate where they become significant as being part of this conversation. But at its foundation, there's not a lot of people that white and Black people are interacting with other than each other. So the tension is going to be the Black-white binary, the Black-white tension. That is the foundation for our understanding of race, particularly in the US context. So he says that affirmative action is not just about all these people have been plundered. No, it's about Black people, right? And then out of that is where you can kind of have these other larger conversations, women and Native Americans, and et cetera, right? And he said, we also know this because we can see that the formation of race in American law and policy, we can see how this allows for us to talk more about race and less about the actual racism. And we also see how formations differ across time and space. So again, showing the social constructionist view of race, something that changes across time and space. Race, Blackness, whiteness doesn't mean the same in 1821 that it did in 1921. And it definitely doesn't mean the same thing in 1921 that it does in 2021. So what does it mean to be Black? Well, it depends on the context. What it means to be Black in the United States is different from what it means to be Black in Brazil, or to be Black in Germany, or to be Black in any parts of sub-Saharan Africa, South Africa, Cameroon, Uganda, whatever. Sometimes even being Black is different within the US context. To be a Black Southerner versus a Black Northerner, or to be a Black person from an urban area as opposed to a Black person from a rural area. So Blackness in and of itself is malleable. Therefore, race in and of itself is malleable and can change and can transform. It's a very dynamic identity. More significantly, the relevance and import of Blackness is not constant across American history. So it's going to change and going to develop over time. Let me see. Oh, also another piece is that Ta-Nehisi Coates argues that we should never forget that this world was made. These things are created. Whiteness, Blackness, they are created. How are they created? Through policy. Slave codes, Black codes, Jim Crow, redlining, GI bills, housing, covenants, New Deals, mass incarceration. All of these things are race, or these things produce race. But all of these are examples of what? Racism. Slave codes, Black codes, GI bills, housing, all of those things are examples of racism. Racism played throughout these vehicles. But most people don't want to talk about the vehicles that are used to help funnel and empower race. They would just rather talk about race as this thing. And that's why Ta-Nehisi Coates says, oh no, we're going to make a case for reparation. And we're not just going to talk race. We're going to actually go into what has created race, the policies that have created race. He also says that racism precedes race. So it goes back to what I said earlier. It goes back to what I said earlier. You can't have, or you could have the slave trade. You could have the slave trade, how should I say this? You can have racism without the slave trade, but you can't have the slave trade without racism? Well, no, because again, initially they weren't racist. But in order to justify the slave trade, after people saw that it was making so much money, in order to justify, there was the creation of race and racism. In order to justify that this is necessary for our survival and their survival, that we kidnap this group, bring them to the United States or 13 colonies, whichever time period, and make them work. And so then he ends this by talking about reparations. He says, in the popular mind, reparations is looked at as this kind of race-based scheme of Black people trying to get money, minorities trying to get money. If they have a direct African ancestry, they should get money. But once you understand not just race, because that's just a race idea, but once you understand racism, once you understand the actions of the state and how that perpetuated racism on the federal and state level, if you understand racism as the headwaters of these problems, as injury, as plunder, then you can reorient and focus not on the people, not on where they're from or what they look like, but now you can focus on the injury, what the problem was. And so I think Ta-Nehisi Coates really does a phenomenal job in presenting us with that framework first, before going into his actual case. So yes, thought that was good. Now we will go a little bit into this idea of place. All right, so let's see, place. Looking at this intro of place, some of this comes from your reading, some of this comes from other readings that kind of parallel this reading and extend the thoughts on this reading. One in particular, how we get space, how we get place from space, how to get place from space. Yes. Place is like race, socially constructed. All right. Operating as a socially constructed operation. And it includes the ways in which people and groups interact with each other. Also, how people and groups interact with institutionalized structures, how they interact with the government, how they interact with the economic structures, how they want people to see them and how they see themselves. These are the things that place helps to create and helps us to understand. How do people use area? How do people use land? How do people use their environment, their social environment, their physical environment to make sense of their interaction with themselves and their interactions with others? And place is something that can be used anywhere. You can use place anywhere. You can use place is as a way of helping to understand sociology or social interaction. You can use place in helping to understand political science. I think I said this a while or a second ago. You can use it in so many different disciplines. So it travels through disciplines and it benefits those disciplines as it travels through. A lot like critical race theory. I know critical race theory is something that is under attack. Some people may say it's under attack. Some people agree, some people don't agree with critical race theory. But like critical race theory, you can find critical race theory, especially in sociology, but sociology, law, education, political science, very interdisciplinary, place, same thing. And so typically, historically, when we think about place, we think about a nation, where someone lives. The first way in which you identify as a place, you would say, where are you from? If you ask somebody where are you from, and they tell you, what are some things that immediately come to your mind? Why do you ask somebody where they're from? Either before you really get to know them or after. And the reason why is because there are characteristics associated with place that we want to hurry up and put somebody in so that that can gauge the conversation. And there's nothing wrong with that per se. I guess because we all do it. But it would be kind of cool if maybe we just didn't know and we just interacted with people how we want without having to feel like we need to allow their identity or orientation to then inform the conversation. So just for example, I may not know you. Oh, this is such and such. Oh, okay, hi, such and such. Where are you from? Oh, I'm from Florida. Okay, immediately my mind goes, okay, if this person is from Florida, okay, they're from the South, they did this, that. These are the things that we can talk about. This is what I know about Florida. Cool, cool, cool. If they say I'm from California, oh, okay, California. What do I know about California? Hollywood, beaches, blah, 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 blah. Okay, this can lead this into this kind of conversation, right? So there are place identified characteristics that we all hold all the time. What country are you from? From America? Oh, if you've ever been outside of the country. Oh, you're from America. Okay, you. Or we could be having a conversation. You might be saying some interesting things. Oh, I like this. You know, yeah, I really enjoy being around people. You know, I like loud stuff, you know, traffic. I just don't feel like I'm really alive if I'm not in traffic, if I can't. Well, oh, I didn't get my driver's license till I was maybe 22, 23. So then I may say, where are you from? I'm from New York. Oh, that's why. So we use place to satisfy our inquiries or to inform our inquiries, right? And the first way in which that's done is you ask somebody where they're from or where they were born. because place is connected to nativity. Place is connected to nation and nationality. So we are born into these relationships that place tends to have us in. And there is a bond that happens between people who are born in a similar place or in the same place, right? When I first came to UNF, I had a colleague who emailed me and said, oh, it's good to have another Floridian, right, in the midst. Somebody who is a native of Florida. I'm a native of Florida, Jacksonville specifically. So they said, oh, it's good to have another native Floridian here. Why did the person say that? Because there is a bond of place, right? There's a placeable bonding, and this placeable bonding is fundamental in our human experience and how we interact with each other. And sometimes what can be seen as just a space, undifferentiated space, which means you really can't tell the difference between one thing or another, it's just large space, becomes place. Well, what's the difference between space and place? Space is environmental, place is human characteristics applied to that environment. So this space where you are, the south side of Jacksonville, the place is a college campus, and the place becomes even more dynamic with the students, with the band, with the football team, with the teachers, with the excitement, the parades, and all of these different things. It now becomes place. As we get to know it better, as we put value on it, as we put a mascot, and as the teams win, and you know, as the university has more money and has more resources, now we can start to add value to this place, space. And the value that we added to, or the value added, can transform a space into a place. And so again, what begins as space with no regard, no distinction, can become place with added value. And so how to get from space to place? Place is an important part of our lives. It is an important component of our lives. As soon as we're born, as soon as we come into the world, we're coming into a place. A family place, a geographic place, all right, an economic place. We're coming into it, and then society places us in various identities. It places you in a certain racial identity. It places you in a gender identity. It places you in as you get older, a sexual category. So place is the basic component of our lives. We are always in place. We're never not in place. Now you can be out of place. We will read a piece called Bodies Out of Place by one of my mentors, Dr. Barbara Combs. You can be out of place, but you're never not in a place. You're in a place one way or another from the time you're born to the time you die. So when you live, you're living this localized experience. And in this localized experience, the first thing you need to know is, what is my place? Where do I fit? Not just geographically. We're talking about identity. We can talk about career. You just talk about in college, when you're a freshman, if you're not a freshman. If you're a freshman, you come to college for the first time, you see the classrooms and you see people, especially if you come to a school where maybe you might be the only person that you know right now. So you go into this place, and as you're going into this place, you have to know, how do I fit in? Where's my subgroup? Where's my organization? That I can then come in and then make a place for myself in this collegiate space. So that's typically the first thing we think about anywhere we go. What is the meaning for me being here? How can I add value? What can I gain from being here? So in other words, we are not just in places, but we are places. Our bodies are place-based vehicles, or place-based spaces, if you will. Right? We are these places. Our bodies are these places. Our bodies inevitably become place-based. Why? Because we're not just walking around hollow. There's an added value to us, whether it comes from our intelligence, or our talents, skills, reason. All of these factors help even us as these space creatures to become place. A place where maybe a friend can come to you and seek counsel or advice. Going to the next slide. The living body is central to Casey's discussion of place as a body, of place as a body is always necessarily living in a place and living a place. Notice Casey said living in a place, but you're also living out that place. You're not just living on a college campus, you're living out your college dreams. So you embody the place. So you're living the college experience. If you were to go down to Mardi Gras, you're going to Mardi Gras, but you're also living out the Mardi Gras experience. You're living out what this place means. Places, I think this place is just so fascinating. The living body becomes the place. And bodies and places integrate and interact and interanimate with one another. So you can become a place for someone. Trying to think of if somebody says, oh, I like you. If somebody's throwing a party and they say, yo, you gotta be here. We need you here because you're the life of the party. And telling somebody they're the life of the party is exactly what living a place is. They're not saying you're the party, we have to come to you, but we're going to this space where we're having a party, but then you also bring party with you. So you're living out being a party. I remember when I was not very young, I mean, in my early 20s, and I would go out to clubs and party. And when I would be with my friends, we would go and we would dance and we would have a good time. And I remember there was one time we were on a dance floor and everything was great. And people were surrounding us and was laughing and we were all dancing, having a good time. And people just started inviting us to their parties and they're like, oh, I'm having a party, you should come. People had no idea who we were. We were just having fun. We was all just having fun with each other. And they were like, oh, y'all gotta come to my party. I'm doing something next week, you should come through. Why? Because they saw a place in us. They saw that we attracted a crowd and we were entertaining and the energy was live where we were, right? So we not only embody a place, we become a place. Just as there are no places without the bodies that sustain and vivify them, so there are no lived bodies without the places they inhabit and traverse. So place outside and place inside, our bodies as place inside of places, those coincide, those good work hand in hand. You can't have a place without bodies because bodies add value, bodies have meaning. As human beings, we add meaning. If we didn't add meaning, then everything's just kind of there. So bodies add meaning to a place, or life adds meaning to a place. It doesn't necessarily have to be a human body, but any type of body, life bodies, adds meaning to a place. If there was no life somewhere, who would really want to visit it? What kind of value does it really have if there's no life? That's probably why bodies are always trying to place themselves in places. First to go to the moon, first to go to Mars, first to go to the sky, first to go to the moon. We're constantly trying to put our bodies into spaces for meaning purposes. And so we must embody place. And there are no lived bodies without the places they inhabit and traverse. So anybody who is listening, anybody who is alive is in a place. Place can't be anything without you, but you are not something without place, because everybody here inhabits a place in some way. You inhabit a place. So you're nothing without place. Place is nothing without you. And places are created by human beings through some mark, or again, some sign of human presence. So having to be somewhere, having to live somewhere, to breathe somewhere, to make life somewhere, to experience society somewhere makes a place. A wilderness in itself is placeless. If you go somewhere and there's just nothing there, no life forms, no nothing, it's placeless. It has no human center. But that's why I personally use the notion of life. Because I believe you can have a place without a human. I think that's a human-centered ideology. Oh, there's nothing has value unless I'm there or a human is there. No, places humans not that have value. It's okay, they don't want you there. The animals don't want you there, you don't have to be there. So I do think it's important, or I do think that typically human beings are the ones that are always trying to insert ourselves into people's places and assume that it is nothing until we get there. Going back to race, well, that's how white people felt about sub-Saharan Africa. Well, this place is a jungle, it's uncivilized. Not until we get here can we make it civilized, bring them into modernity. Well, these people have been living very well for the past thousands of years. So place can be a place without you or without a person there. That's my argument. You know, Casey may say something different. So what I would like for you to do as an activity before we go into the next part, I would like for you to watch this link. And after you do that, I want you to pull up a document, pull up a piece of paper, and I want you to type a paragraph or two addressing the following ideas. How do you see elements of place in this song? And give me details from the lecture to explain why these are seen as elements of the place in your song. Very simple. You can write as long as you want or as short as you want, but just know if you write short, it better be good. And it's kind of difficult to say everything that needs to be said in one or two sentences. I don't think I've ever done that. But if you want to try, you can. But if you're not answering the question, if you're not really giving this some serious thought, you may not receive the grade that you're looking for. Right? So how do you see elements of place in this song? And provide details from the lecture to explain your thoughts. So the paper should be double-spaced, Times New Roman 12 font, and the only information that should be at the top is your name of the class, and the title of the essay, but that's optional. And the deadline for this activity is Wednesday, September 1st at 3 p.m. And you submit under web assignments, you submit online. Don't email it to me or nothing. You submit online. And you submit where it says web assignments. All right. So as we continue to the last reading Black Placemaking. So we've talked about race, we've talked about place, the introduction of place. Black placemaking is very significant. It's a very significant piece. And Black placemaking is fairly new. It's a fairly new concept in that it allows for us to take the larger ideas around place and making place and how places get created, and allows us to racialize it and show the distinctions between how racial groups influence and add value to spaces, and how spaces add value, well, I don't want to say add value, and how spaces influence the experiences of people in those places. But in order to get into Black placemaking, there's a couple things we got to talk about first. Motion. Another key element of place is motion, moving. You got to be able to move in and out of spaces. And the moving in and out of spaces and the frequency in which that's done and why it's done and how it's done and what is left behind when it's done helps us to understand place and how value is added to a space. So motion is key to our understanding of how place and body interaction, how those work hand in hand. Place is not monolithic, it's dynamic, it's static. And place, when added value, should encourage movement, some kind of movement, some kind of motion. This is why migration is so important. I can't remember, but I'm pretty sure we're going to talk about migration at some point in this semester. But migration is extremely important because movement in and out of spaces adds value to a place. Right? The United States would not be, the modern United States would not be what it is had it not been for the explorers migrating from one place to another and deciding to stay. So whether you're talking about exploration, whether you're talking about, like, for example, the Great Migration, where Black folks from the South moved to the North and added value to urban cities and shaped the landscape of urban cities. And now you see this reverse migration back to the South, where now the South is becoming more urban. The South is becoming the center, the core for commerce, for research, for American thought, American politics. South is now very important in that way. And so you see that with a large reverse migration of people being priced out of the North, being priced out of the bigger cities and moving to what's seen as smaller cities, which are now becoming bigger cities in the South. So movement and motion and migration adds value to a space or adds value to that place. And even when the body stays in place, sometimes it changes the position of some of its parts. So even if you were to stay, I'll give a good example. I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida. I grew up on the north side of Jacksonville, Florida. So I don't know if any of you are from here, or those who may be from here may not be, but I grew up in the Moncrief, Lake Forest, Edgewood area, right? My experience in this place, right? It's considered a place, it's a city with people, with vibrant movement and everything's going on. So I experienced this place from birth till graduating high school. And then I spent 1 year of college. I went to community college here for 1 year and then went off to a 4-year college. And so my experience of living in Jacksonville as a student, as a young boy, and growing into a young man, it was one way of how I understood it. I was in one position. Then I went off to college and did all these different things and got a PhD and lived in other cities. And now coming back to Jacksonville, I'm in a totally different position than what I was in before I left the first time. And now coming back, the place looks totally different. I know the streets, I know the buildings, I know UNF. I hadn't been to UNF in almost 20 years since a prom that I attended when I was in high school. Well, I think early college. She was a senior in high school. It was my first year in college. A prom that I attended at UNF, but I didn't know much else about UNF. But yeah, the city looks totally different because now I'm an adult. I have responsibilities. I have a job, a career, all these different things happening in the city that I did not have before. So I'm in a totally different position, which makes the place look different for me. Not necessarily physically. Some things have been built, obviously, but not really physically as much as the feeling of now what this place means. Why? Because my position changed in the place. Bodies move within places or between places, and in so doing helps constitute places, whilst places constitute these bodies. So as bodies are moving around in places, moving as you move from city to city, or from one apartment to another, or from an apartment to a house, or as you move from a freshman to a sophomore to a junior to a senior inside of UNF, you're giving credence to wherever you are. You as a student, as you're moving throughout your college experience, you're adding value to UNF. And then in turn, UNF adds value to you when you get a degree. Now you're a college educated person, and then you may be able to go out and get a certain type of job or demand a certain type of income or whatever. So bodies move within places and between places. And in so that helps places kind of validate bodies. Bodies validate places and places validate bodies. There's a beautiful kind of symbiotic relationship happening with place and bodies, right? Very interesting. Also, place gathers different bodies, experiences, histories, language, and then places them together in this kind of neat puzzle, this neat kind of array, this cornucopia of culture and people with certain boundaries. So again, talking about UNF. UNF brings people from various class groups, various countries, various racial groups, various regions, and now they're together. These people have different histories, some speak different languages, but they're together in this place, on this campus for something. Usually it's to graduate. So they're holding them here, so they learn something and they graduate. But even though they're here, there's still these small little boundaries between people. Sometimes they may cross over, but people are here. And then you may have people of various racial groups as freshmen. So there's boundaries around freshmen. And then as sophomores, and there's boundaries around being a sophomore and a junior, boundaries around that, and a senior, boundaries around that. Or if you play football, there's boundaries around that. Or if you are in the band, boundaries around that. Or if you're a bio major, there's boundaries. Or if you're an English major, boundaries, or computer science, whatever. So there's still certain boundaries even within this place, this diverse, dynamic, place. And so places are qualified by their own contents and by the ways in which these contents are articulated. So people look at how others understand what makes up this place. UNF is qualified based on the students, the professors, the faculty, staff, the board, president. All of these things make up the quality of the place. If a lot of students didn't graduate UNF, if a lot of students didn't get good jobs after leaving UNF, if the professors are horrible at UNF, if there were not good experiences from people who work or go to school at UNF, the quality of the school and the representation of the school would plummet because of the contents that make up the place. So bodies and what bodies bring to place, validate the place and qualify the place. And the quality of that place in turn should pour back into the bodies to bring more bodies. That's how place works. And so when we look at place, now taking place and putting it in sociology, and then when we do that, then we're going to take it and add on this racialized component to it, this notion of Black placemaking. So sociologist Thomas Gearin, again, he was the one who, this was in his piece, a space for place in sociology. One of my favorite pieces on place, probably because I study place and I'm a sociologist. But a space for place in sociology. He says a spot in the universe becomes a place only when it enscones history or utopia, danger or security, identity or memory. These are the things that help to make a place valuable. When it has a history, a utopia, a danger to it, a security to it, and people can identify with it. And all of these things can be applied to UNF or even Jacksonville or wherever you're from. You think of how people got to wherever city you come from. How do people live and enjoy living there? What is great about it? Is it near the beach? Is it the weather? Is it the food? Is it something that makes it a utopia? Is it the culture? Why do people run away from it? Is it dangerous? Is it crime? Is it the poor weather? How is it secured? How is it maintained? And then how do people identify? If you're from Alabama, how do people identify? Roll Tide. You hear that everywhere. If you're from Jacksonville, how do people identify? Duval. Or wherever you're from. So there are certain identities, right? Characteristics that we apply to that place. And you identify with that. That's something that lets people know this is where I'm from. This is what's important to me. This is why this place is important. And let me show you through some kind of action, some kind of hand signal, some kind of call, or something. This is what makes place. And so we ignore the authors of Black Placemaking Celebration, Celebration Play and Poetry, by Zandria Robinson and Marcus Hunter, both of them phenomenal sociologists. I think Zandria is at Georgetown now. She might have been at, she was at a university in Memphis when she wrote this, but she's at Georgetown now. And Marcus Hunter was at, he was born in Philly, but now he is in UCLA, I believe. I think he's the chair of the African American Studies Department, but he got his Ph.D. in sociology. And so they wrote a book called Chocolate Cities, where they really expand on this idea of Black placemaking. And so in writing this, they say, we ignore neither assaults on Black placemaking from the outside as in lethal policing and destructive urban planning, nor internal dangers, such as homophobia, harassment, and homicide. They say instead we highlight how Black people make places amidst and in spite of those realities. Black placemaking refers to the ways that urban Black Americans create sites of endurance, belonging, and resistance. So what they're arguing is that in the context of placemaking, most times when people discuss race and then inadvertently place, because it's rare that people kind of explicitly talk about place, but inadvertently they talk about race and then place, it's always from this, what's the time? So it's this deficit model. It's the model of danger, of hurt, of frustration, of anger, of survival. Ultimately, what they're saying, every time you talk about Black people, somebody getting killed, somebody getting shot, somebody on drugs, somebody family disrupted. I was recently watching an interview with Kevin Hart and Ice Cube. I know y'all probably know who Kevin Hart is. I don't know if y'all know who Ice Cube is. Ice Cube, he was a rapper in a group called NWA. And then he went on to go solo and he made movies and, you know, he's big influence and he's politically conscious and active and things like that. Controversial. And so Kevin Hart and Ice Cube, Kevin Hart was interviewing Ice Cube and Ice Cube played in this film called Boys in the Hood because Ice Cube grew up in Los Angeles and was a part of a group that came out of Compton that is considered to be a ghetto, a hood, whatever, right? And so he was asked to be in this movie called Boys in the Hood about growing up in South Central Los Angeles, area that was known for gang violence and police brutality and poverty and that sort of thing, right? So growing up, he did the movie. The movie was a hit. Everybody, why people all over, he was talking about how he went to this Paris Film Festival and he went to the Paris Film Festival and people who couldn't even speak the English language. This movie came out in the early 90s. People who couldn't even speak the English language could read the subtitles and love the movie. So he said, man, I know people in America are gonna love it when they see it. And people it was nominated for an Academy Award, this great film. After that, Ice Cube talks about how he started seeing all these movies about Black people growing up in the hood, and it was violence, and it was drugs, and it was illicit sex, and it was all these things. It was like it was like a war zone. And he looked and he said, "Was it really like that growing up? Because I don't remember that." And Kevin Hart asked him. He said, "Well, was it like that growing up?" He said, "Well, sometimes, but not all the time. There were a lot of fun times growing up in South Central Los Angeles. There were times of play. There was times where we were just hanging out. There were all kinds of experiences, things we got into, things we got out of. It wasn't always just shoot 'em up, violence, killing people. It probably wasn't even like that most of the time." So he went on to do a movie called Friday. And Friday takes place in the same area, but it's a very lighthearted, joking, kind of movie that takes place in one day, and it's much more lighthearted than the shoot 'em up violence, drugs that's often found, at least at that time, in Black film. Now things are a little bit more diverse, but at that time, that's all you saw, and that seemed like the singular representation of Black people in cinema and in Hollywood. And so coming back to the scholarship, what Robinson and Hunter are saying is that while there are issues of homophobia, homonegativity, harassment, homicide within Black places, for sure, we're not going to deny issues related to lethal policing, police brutality, urban planning, gentrification, and poverty. Yeah, these things absolutely happen. We're not going to focus on that because that is not the singular experiences of Black people in place. When we intersect race and place, those are not the only results. Those are just some results. And so we choose to look at how, when you intersect race and place, you get sites of endurance, you get sites of beauty, you get sites of play, creativity, belonging, resistance, community, unity, revolution, power, friendships, love, sex, all of these ideas and aspects and components of a full and complete life you can have, and Black people have, within a place. And it's not just what you may see in the mainstream media. And they use this to help create this idea of Black placemaking. Again, the reason why the Black placemaking is significant is because it is resisting the racism within the larger context of placemaking. So it is purposefully used to help expand place and race, to include all of the dynamics of what it means to be Black in a place like the United States, in a place like the United States, and then sub aspects of the United States, in rural areas and urban areas, and the South and the North and the West, wherever. And that's why this piece is very, very important. Let's see. So, Black placemaking is a framework that helps us to understand the way place also provides not only this meaning of a much more dynamic Black life, but it also helps us to understand the disadvantages, the stigmas that exist in Black life. And then when we do that, we can now apply this framework to other people. Now you don't have to just have a Black placemaking. You can have a poor placemaking, Native American placemaking, an immigrant placemaking, mentally ill placemaking, HIV and AIDS placemaking, because all of these groups have to find meaning in hostile spaces. That's what Black placemaking does. It allows for people to find meaning, both positive and negative, both the good, the bad, and the ugly, in the midst of sometimes hostile spaces. And Black people aren't the only people that have to do that. But oftentimes what we find is, within theories, within movements, things like that, what you find is you typically find out of race comes out of race comes the momentum for other types of movements. Now, I'm not saying it always happens that way, but sometimes, generally, right, that's what happens. And so the argument is that if we can cultivate this Black placemaking framework, now we can take this and now we can apply it to so many other people. A woman's placemaking. So many different types of people that can help make sense of their spaces. And so the concept and the idea of Black placemaking looks to counter the scholarship and looks to contribute to the negative portrayals of Black neighborhoods, whether you're talking about in scholarship or in media, cinema, Hollywood, music, whatever. Just like in Hollywood, for a long time in the 1980s and even the 1990s, all the research on Black people was Black people in the hood, Black people in the ghetto, poor, the underclass, the underprivileged. Look at these poor Black people. We need to help them. And it's not always like that. In fact, only 1/4 of, 25%, which is still more than the larger society in terms of demographics, live below the poverty line. Now, that's still a lot. It shouldn't be that much, but that means 75% live above the poverty line. So it's not necessarily that it is these places of just that are destitute and demolished. And so it counters that scholarship and then contributes to having new conversations around that scholarship. even if we're all going to talk about poor people, people in poverty, people in the ghetto, right? We can also talk about what is being done to help bring value, to help bring unity. How do these people take these spaces and take these places and bring identity to it and bring life to it? Because it happens all the time. That's why gentrification occurs. You stick a bunch of poor people, particularly poor Black people, in a certain area, they build it up, they make it valuable, and then the people outside, typically white middle-class people outside, then say, oh, I want to go back there again. So then they come back, prices go up, investments go up, and then those people who made that thing cool and valuable, now they got to move out. So there's value where there are poor Black people, poor minorities, places that are seen as invaluable, places that become spaces that now these people make places again. And so this concept of Black placemaking is a way of, turning around these negative portrayals without losing sight of the relationship between structures and agencies, between domination and resistance. So they're not saying, oh, well, we don't want to talk about crime. We don't want to talk about poverty. We don't want to talk about gentrification. Oh, no, we will. We will absolutely talk about structure and agency, systemic racism, and then personal consequence. We're going to talk about all of these things, but we're also going to include a much more dynamic and full conversation that gives a much better understanding of how the intersection of race and place plays out in the experiences of Black people, and then eventually people of various groups. And so essentially what we see is placemaking versus Black placemaking. You see placemaking versus Black placemaking. So placemaking is the simple idea that people transform the places which we find ourselves into, which we find ourselves in. Okay. So people transform these places. That's what placemaking is. Wherever they are, they do what is necessary to create and add value to that place. Black placemaking says that individual outcomes are tied to the well-being of the group that bind them economically and politically, even as internal practices of marginalization can threaten unity. So even though these people are not, even though within a place you have class stratification, you have gender stratification, you have sexual stratification, place stratification. With Black people generally, because Black people of various groups tend to have what's called a linked fate, and they talked about that in the reading, a linked fate, and that they have to be together anyway, because we all Black, whether you're rich or poor. That's not what's going to be asked of you if you get pulled over by the police. The first thing they're going to see is this one thing. If a young boy is in a classroom with a teacher that don't like Black kids, they're not going to ask him, how much did your parents make? That will determine how I treat you, not necessarily. And so because generally Black people have this understanding that regardless of my class status, while class can mitigate some aspects of racism, it's not going to mitigate all of it. And so there is this kind of unity and regard that Black people have for a place that the larger population may not have for a place because of the conditions in which Black people have to live and navigate in the United States. Placemaking assumes human competence, which is often not an assumption granted to Black urban residents. So generally, if a white person is seen in a place, there is this automatic idea that place is safe, secure, it's okay. May not, There's a general assumption of competence in safety, in whiteness. I mean, if we're just honest, most white people, and then even just most people, or a lot of people, may not feel uncomfortable around white people or in white spaces, even though the crime statistics show that white and Black people commit crimes at roughly the same level. I think it's only like a couple of percentage points between them, but it's roughly the same. So people talk about Black on Black crime, white on white crime and all that. No, people just commit crimes. But again, because of race, we have this assumption of human competency and human decency that seems to be inherent in white people, that Black people don't get that kind of preconceived idea. So Black placemaking seeks to analyze and recover the agency of urban Blacks often lost in conventional perspectives. So these stereotypes. I'll give you an idea. I remember I went to go work out the other morning, and I'm leaving LA Fitness, and there's a group of Black guys. They probably might have been like 10, 11 of them. And they're all coming into LA Fitness, and they're asking questions about, I guess, I don't know if they wanted to sign up. Maybe they were a football team. I'm not sure who they were. And as they were leaving, they were all outside in the parking lot, just hanging out, sitting on their cars, talking. And if a girl walked past, they might look, they might talk to her, whatever, keep going. And they were just talking. And I thought to myself, I said, man, I'm not afraid. It looks interesting to me. And I'm overhearing their conversation, and it's kind of funny. I'm not afraid. I'm not scared. I don't think they're going to do anything to me. But I can imagine in the wrong scenario, with the wrong person, seeing these brothers just being here, just being Black, just living their lives, it could turn into a very bad situation. It's happened to me in the past, and I could definitely see that happen. It just depends on where they are. And so Black placemaking looks to reanalyze and allow for the agency and allow for the humanity of Black people in certain places. And it is a framework to help build that humanity back into them. Because with conventional perspectives, with traditional ideas, with traditionally racist ideas, they don't automatically have that assumption of decency that oftentimes people of other racial groups, particularly white people, it's oftentimes assumed. And then placemaking recognizes that race and racism, especially race and racism is manifested in residential segregation, which begets Black political consciousness and offers opportunities to create new sites of gathering. So as we move forward into placemaking, adding that Black placemaking piece allows for us to see and to recognize that place leads to, and placemaking leads to residential segregation. But that residential segregation then typically refers to or makes Black political consciousness consequential. Now we have to be able to rally around this type of political or social identity and idea to help us gain what was either taken away or never given to us at all. So Black placemaking looks at the ability of these people in these residents in these areas to shift oppressive regimes, to shift oppressive tactics, to shift the oppression that many times they live under into areas and sites and spaces and places of play and pleasure and celebration and politics and beauty and culture and ideas and vibrance. And this is what place and Black placemaking does, changes the narrative. And it changes that intersection of race and place to something that is much more dynamic, something that is much more beautiful and accurately reflects the lived experiences of Black people in the United States. Okay, so they end this piece, which I think is really interesting, with this poem by Gwendolyn Brooks. I think Gwendolyn Bennett was in the Harlem Renaissance. So yeah, this would be Gwendolyn Brooks from the Black Arts Movement. And Black, and the poem says, Blackness is a title, is a preoccupation, is a commitment. Blacks ought to comprehend and in which you ought to perceive your glory. The word Black has geographic power, pulls everybody in. Blacks here, there, Blacks wherever they may be. And I think this is significant and powerful to end this lecture here, because that's where Ta-Nehisi Coates' Blacks Here, There, Everywhere, I believe was the title of the piece, that provided the foundation for his framework and his theoretical framework on race. So that's where we started. And this notion of Blacks here, there, everywhere, this placing of Black people and Black bodies and the value that it brings is also ended right here with Zandria Robinson and Marcus Hunter's work. Also, so I want you to read this poem, right? Then there's another piece, two of them. I'm not going to read them out loud right now, but I want you to read them. One is called The South by Emma Lazarus. I don't know if she was born 1849 to 1887. I'm not sure if that was like her born and death, or it was just another significance of that time. But Emma Lazarus, if I'm not mistaken, more than likely is white. Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday. Some of you may know this piece, some of you may not. Billie Holiday was a jazz singer, and Strange Fruit was a piece that she wrote. No, sorry, she sang it. It was written by a Jewish man named Abel Meerpool, I believe. And Abel Meerpool wrote this piece after he witnessed the lynching in the South. He came to the South and saw, I think he either witnessed the lynching or he may have like seen it on the news or something. But he saw it. He saw lynching occur, and it prompted him to write this poem, and he called it Strange Fruit. And then Billie Holiday read the poem. And then Billie Holiday was also traveling in the South. And as she was traveling in the South, she recognized or saw a lynching. She saw a man hanging from a tree. And so it caused her, and it influenced her and her, her consciousness, her Black consciousness, her political consciousness. And she recorded this song called Strange Fruit, and it became a very popular song, especially up north. And in the South, oftentimes she was arrested or violently thrown out of clubs where she sang for singing this song, because people in the South didn't want to hear this. And a lot of her audience, well, she had audience, white and Black. So read The South by Emma Lazarus, and then read Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday. Okay, also, and then this last piece right here, on the previous slide, that was found at the end of your reading. And then what I would like for you to do on this last slide, there was discussion board assignment. I would like for you to engage in this discussion board. So what you're going to find is this discussion board post is going to be called Placemaking. And if you go to your syllabus, you'll see the instructions for how I want you to participate in the discussion board. And you're going to answer the following questions. Okay. First thing you're going to answer is, what does the poem at the end of the Black Placemaking article mean to you? Okay, so that's the first one we went over. We were talking about Blacks here, there, everywhere. And I want you to explain that in your own words. What does that mean? And then I want you to talk about the similarities and differences between both of these Souths, Emma Lazarus's South, as well as Billie Holiday's South. And Billie Holiday wasn't born or raised in the South, but she traveled the South when she would perform. And I want you to talk about the similarities and the differences between the Souths and what is the value of the South in these two places? How are they the same? How are they different? What is the place? What placemaking do you see? What kind of values? What kind of motion? We talked about motion. We talked about migration. We talked about added value. We talked about bodies. So I'm expecting to hear and see some great responses and posts, because there's so much there, so much richness in both that poem, Emma Lazarus's poem, as well as Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday. So what kind of elements of placemaking do you see in both of these pieces? How did the South as a place in Strange Fruit influence Black placemaking? So if you think about the South as a place, and you think about people who experience this strange fruit, and the reason why it's called strange fruit is because fruit should be the only thing hanging from trees, and Abel Meerpool is saying, well, this is a strange kind of fruit because people shouldn't be hanging from trees. So clearly this is again talking about lynching. So how did the South as a place where lynching occurred so regularly influence how Black people now made a place for themselves in the South, outside the South, in the larger United States? If your background is in African-American studies, you may know a little bit more than maybe somebody who does not. And I know this class is made up of people from varying groups. And then, some people just may know, some people may not. There's really no right or wrong answer necessarily. There are some more dynamic answers, but I do want you to think about, how does seeing something so traumatic and so atrocious influence how people now make places for themselves in a certain place or outside a certain place? So in other words, how did Black people respond to being strange fruit? How did they respond in the South? How did they respond out of the South? You can even Google that or something if you want to, or read up on it or whatever. But how do you think that occurs? How does placemaking happen in the midst of tragedy? And that's exactly what Robinson and Hunter are talking about. In the midst of police brutality and urban poverty and all this other kind of stuff, we're going to do a study on the celebration and the play and the politics that are happening in these areas. And they did their study in Chicago, right? So I want you to create your discussion board post. I also want you to respond to someone else's post. Again, read the instructions that are found in your syllabus. And this should be fulfilled before 3 p.m. on September 6th. Let me make sure that's right. Because if you're looking at this August 30th or September 1st, yeah. So so September 6th. And the other assignment is due Wednesday, September 1st at 3 p.m. So one is due on Wednesday, and then one is due on the following Monday. Yeah. So that is it. If you have any questions, any comments, feel free to email me. Feel free to come into my office hours. Office hours are a lot easier for me if you have any questions. But you can also email me and I'll do my best to get back to you. Some people have been inboxing me. That's not the best way in the Canvas, but I can respond there as well sometimes. Yeah, email's just better, but email, office hours, or inbox. All right, so with that said, have a great week, have a great day, whatever day you're seeing this, whatever day you're watching this. If it's on a Friday, then have a great weekend, and you'll see me later, and hopefully I'll see you in the office hours.